Okay, so here we are. And what I'm going to do is, I don't hear anybody unmuted, so I think we're okay. I will unmute all, and you feel free to chat if you need to bring up something. And we'll just begin. So here we are on session 4, which is the outcome of all of this Sturm und Drang, this Reformation and revolution and Counter-Reformation. And I want to talk about the impact Reformation had on the claims of monarchy and on political theory, and on the outbreak of civil war and confessionally based war on the continent, or sectarian war, if you will, that generates into the first, if you will, World War, which winds up providing the foundation of the balance of power as we've come to know it through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, but as early as the 17th century. And the dynamism, the technological and economic dynamism generated in Europe, and I think to some degree with the Protestant Reformation as one of its leading causes. So we'll talk about that. We'll end with something of an art gallery looking at one of the successful poster children for European dynamism, which is the Dutch Golden Age. But before we get there, let us plunge in. And what on the first slide I want to address in the first couple of slides is the impact that the Reformation had on issues of political legitimacy. So political thought generally, and the sense of what was the source of political authority, what made it legitimate, since the old consensus had broken down. So the first major bullet, the question of political legitimacy. And I mentioned that for centuries, the Pope had been in a stable, balanced power arrangement with the Holy Roman Empire. The only issue really being who had temporal precedence in the world. Was it the Pope or was it the Holy Roman Emperor? There really wasn't a question of legitimacy, just a precedence. They were both thought to be legitimate claims. The reform of the Protestants, however, since it was a challenge to papal authority, it created two very large questions, one of which was, what is the relationship of church and state? And an even larger question, who or what confers legitimacy on each side? So what makes a particular form of government the legitimate form? Where did this come from? Is it given by God? How do we arrive at it? Now, in this box in the middle of the slide, I make the point that since the bias of the Protestant Reformation was a turning away from Catholic corporatism to Protestant individualism. Luther's, I mentioned here, Luther's validation of the individual conscience and the defense of every man's right to read and interpret Scripture opens the gate for an explosion of new ideas. It opens the gate to rampant sectarianism. So the old consensus, there was a church, there was only one church. The comedian Lenny Bruce, in one of his famous routines, always asks the question, why is the Catholic Church the only the church? And in fact, indeed, before the 16th century, it was the only the church. But that old consensus was once accepted uncritically. Now every and any principle must be argued and defended logically. We mentioned that this period was the age of the emergence of absolutism in monarchy. monarchs claiming to be absolute monarchs. And I want to point out, and I do below in one of the lower bullets, that this is a novelty. This was never claimed traditionally. Traditionally, in the medieval world, the late Roman into the medieval world, monarchy was in a feudal, F-E-U-D-A-L, a feudal dance with the aristocracy and the clergy. Each caste had rights, and feudal authority was one that passed power down the chain as it received power up the chain. The claims that the king or the monarch had absolute power and unquestioned power had never been made before, but it is being made in the 16th and 17th century. As remember back in the first lecture, we talked about changes in the modes of warfare, and the rise of capitalism created a crisis with the aristocracy, which was the main class that would limit the authority of a monarch. King John and the barons at Runnymede. But here we have a change in the power and situation of the traditional aristocracy. It's been fundamentally weakened, and monarchs without this countervailing institution called the aristocracy can try to arrogate power to themselves. And so a theory of divine right, the phrase by the grace of God. So James I of England, who was originally James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, writes a book, The True Law of Free Monarchies, and makes a formal claim to divine right authority, which will continue all through the 17th century, through Louis XIV, and the French tried to assert it without concessions until Louis XVI can't assert any longer, and it ends with his beheading. But here you have a redefinition of political reality, a reformatting of the question. If the Holy Roman Empire claims he was given his crown by the papacy, now the absolute monarchs of Western Europe are claiming that they have it by a direct divine right. Now, the Reformation has introduced the reformist elements in the Reformation. So the radical reformers, more the Calvinists than the Lutherans, have seen legitimacy as deriving from covenants, as they call them, between the church and God. So they go back to the Old Testament and they say, there are all these, a covenant is a kind of a contract, even though they're called covenants. And that God has entered with the Israelites deals. You are my people and I owe you X, and I am your God and you owe me Y. And although covenants were pacts that are centered on theological issues, grace, salvation, and the like, they begin to take a slightly different form inside Reformed religion. Now, since Reformed churches are collections of saved individuals, it's not a corporate body like the Catholic Church. There are no bishops and popes and people speaking for the church as a whole. We, the church, are all of us in our individual relationship with God brought together as a community. So we are all in our separate covenants, if you will, with God. We have our personal relationship. It's the personal salvation is the emphasis. And this was a position common to all the Reformed churches, the Presbyterians in Scotland, Huguenots in France, Puritans in England, Pilgrims who are Puritans in New England. I Puritani is the opera of the moment here. Now, these covenants in the late 16th century, covenant theory, Reformed church covenant theory begins to influence political theory. And I've mentioned a main figure, George Buchanan, in this development. There will be many more. This is a man, a Presbyterian, a political theorist, a humanist, a poet. He was the teacher of Michel de Montaigne. Writes a book, The Right of the Kingdom in Scotland, in 1579, which was the book that James I of England, that I just referred to in the previous slide, wrote his book, Asserting Divine Right, as a response to. Buchanan develops a political theory of covenant, and he calls it a social contract. And he's the first, there's another guy too, but he is among the first of the political theorists to start philosophizing from the foundation of the base argument of a state of nature. He says, well, let's look at how society evolves. We all were in a state of nature, and we made in the state of nature a social contract amongst ourselves with rulers according to which we, the people, still retain ultimate rights and sovereignty that can be withdrawn from the ruler. So out of a state of nature will come contracts between the citizens of a society and the rulers, and the sovereignty of the individual citizens and the rights of the individual citizens are sacrosanct as part of this contract. And rights go in both directions. You can hear already in this the anticipation of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, the early Enlightenment theorists, and their arguments from state of nature to how society develops and derives legitimate political authority for groups of people. All of that contract theory that the Enlightenment was going to use as a focal point begins to develop out of Reformed Protestantism, out of covenant theory. You remember, if you were paying attention in the 6th grade or whenever it was, the Mayflower Compact of 1620 forms a civil body politic to enact laws and offices for the Commonwealth. That's their phrase, civil body politic in the compact. It's an agreement among the Pilgrim Fathers that this is how laws are to be formed. This is where their authority comes from. Their authority comes from our agreement to bond together. And if we didn't make this compact, if we didn't make this covenant, if we didn't make this contract, as Thomas Hobbes suggests in the 1660s, it would be the war of all against all. And life would be nasty, brutish, and short. So let's look at England, and we'll get a better picture of exactly what I'm describing. So a little background. So in England, we have Anglicans, we have Catholics, and we have Reformers who are of the radical sort, either Presbyterian or Congregationalists, looking to reform from inside the Anglican Church. Henry VIII has repudiated the papacy, but he wants to maintain the Catholic tradition of rituals and the basic sacramental orthodoxy. Not all of them but most of them. Under his short-lived son, Edward VI, Anglican Church becomes aggressively Protestant. This results in a very brief 2-month monarchy of Mary Tudor, Henry's child by his first wife, the daughter of the Spanish family, the Spanish monarchs, the Catholic daughter of the Spanish monarchs. And she briefly tries to restore Catholicism, and that goes belly up. And Elizabeth finally, after a couple of years, assumes power and maintains it for 45 years. Elizabeth I, the baby daughter of Henry VIII, and restores a moderate Anglicanism. She winds up executing the Scottish Catholic claimant and mother of James I, Mary Stuart, Maria Stuarda, as the operas would have it. Although the James was born to a Catholic mother, he gets raised as a Protestant for the most part. So James VI and first, the Stuart king, he holds both the Scottish and English thrones. He winds up commissioning the King James Bible. Of note, there is a revolutionary plot to blow up Parliament, the gunpowder plot, and it winds up being used. Guy Fawkes, they still have Guy Fawkes stay in England. It's used as an excuse to introduce anti-Catholic laws in England. James, though, does manage to antagonize Reformed Calvinists, both the Puritans and Presbyterians, by trying to introduce the role of bishops into the church, and they're not having it. And he asserts divine right and antagonizes Parliament, who wants to argue for a contract sovereignty by attempting to force increased appropriations. He wants to raise taxes on their heads, ship money it was called, which leads to the Civil War. And eventually it's going to lead to the execution of his heir, Charles I. So parliamentarians versus royalists. The House of Commons, although it was a collection of aristocrats and well-off new men from business and the emerging capitalist class, while the royalists tended to be Anglican, the parliamentarians tended to be a mix, and anybody with reformist leanings, with its inherent anti-hierarchical attitude, they would have been parliamentarians. So you get this new party rivalry in Stuart England between the parliamentarians and the royalists, and it breaks out between 1640 and 1660 in civil war, and it is war. Charles I resists parliamentary demands for a constitutional monarchy, which would recognize the contractual nature of the king's legitimacy. And he asserts his absolutist prerogative. So in England, absolutist monarchy comes straight up against the new contractarian theory, and it results in war. In France, absolute monarchy just wins for another century and a half. He tries to levy taxes without parliamentary consent. He marries a Catholic. He triggers a war and is executed in 1649. The parliamentary party creates the famous, under Oliver Cromwell, the famous New Model Army, a professional army. They're not dealing with militias anymore. A professional national force. And within that New Model Army, a sect appears, a sub-party, if you will, known as the Levelers or Diggers. These are parliamentarians dominated by Reformed Puritan elements. and they were, with asperity, referred to by the royalists as the Roundheads, of course, because of their haircuts. Political extremists. Their name came from their belief in absolute economic equality based on a variety of biblical passages. They tried to reinvent the social order grounded in their ideal of a small, egalitarian, agrarian community. And that's because it was agrarian. The other aspirative term was diggers, the diggers. They were regarded as forerunners of later anarchist and agrarian socialist movements. Now, if I can jump over for a second to, this is that document that I had, two-page document from the Putney debates that I had suggested that you might have an opportunity to read for this session. And I just want to look at a couple of quotes, because what it is a distillation. Somebody took minutes. Allegedly, this was the actual part of the actual debate. It goes on for reams. Debate between the radicals in the camp, the levelers, as represented in this document by Colonel Thomas Rainsborough, and Henry Ireton, the son-in-law of Cromwell, who speaks for the big money interests, the grandees. And this famous first passage that I have in yellow here, Rainsborough, and a phrase that is every English school child knows. For really, I think that the poorest he that is in England has a life to live as the greatest he. The poorest he and the greatest he. And therefore, truly, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent to put himself under that government. And I do think that the poorest man in England is not at all bound in a strict sense to that government, that he has not had a voice to put himself under. So unless he's had a voice in the forming of that government, unless in effect he has had the vote, in a strict sense, he's not part of it. And I am confident that when I have heard the reasons against it, something will be said to answer those reasons, so much that I should doubt whether he was an Englishman or no that should doubt of these things. And Ireton presents the more traditional English view, which, well, let's take a look at the part I've highlighted here. From our part, I think it is no right at all. I think that no person has a right to an interest or share in the disposing or determining of the affairs of the kingdom, and in choosing those that shall determine what laws we shall be ruled by here. No person has a right to this that has not, and this is the magic phrase, that has not a permanent fixed interest in this kingdom. And those persons together are properly the representative of this kingdom, and consequently are also to make up the representers of this kingdom, and who taken together to comprehend whatsoever is of real or permanent interest in this kingdom. Going back to the phrase, that no person that has not a permanent fixed interest, by which he means property. And if you look down, I'm onto the second page, in that yellow section again, the meanest man in England ought to have a voice in the election of the government he lives under, but only if he has some local interests. I say this, that those that have the meanest local interests, that man that has but 40 shillings a year, he has as great a voice in the election of a knight for the shire as he that has 10,000 a year or more. And this is the famous in England 40 shilling freehold. If you have a 40 killing property, it grants you the right of the vote. If indeed you live at a level of property less than that, you have no right in the kingdom. And this is a bias that you will find not only in English law, and for that matter, early on in American law and common law, running all through the next couple of centuries, but it will also be the foundation of political theory in England. You will see with John Locke, in fact, if any of you sat through the course in the Enlightenment that we had a year ago or so, and we took a peek at Locke, he claimed that all political sovereignty came out of the claims of property that were founded in the state of nature. That property was the foundation of political sovereignty. And let me go back and change. So at the bottom of this slide, back where we were, in summation, Protestant reform, the Protestant Reformation, it leads to a revolution in political theory by challenging divine right and introducing the concepts of both social contract and constitutionalism. The path leads directly to the political philosophies of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, to the Enlightenment and to the modern world. And contract theory in the German and Dutch parts of Protestant Europe also dug in. We have Hugo Grotius on the continent. We have Pufendorf, these contract law theorists who were speaking the same language as Hobbes and Locke in England. And I think we have really to thank the Protestant Reformation for this development in political thought. Anyhow, on to the continent. So between 1618 and 1648, the whole of Europe blows up. It starts as a war of religion with, in the Holy Roman Empire, the little states that were Catholic, taking up arms and uniting with each other against those states, those principalities that had Protestant leadership. But it winds up, once the Catholic emperor, who is really a Spaniard at root, tries to impose Catholicism on the entire empire, it develops into a Protestant league versus a Catholic league. And this winds up morphing into a war of the great powers. So ironically, 1635, as you see in that bullet on the right, France, a Catholic country predominantly, despite its Huguenot elements, enters the war on the Protestant side because it wants to be a counter to the Spanish monarchy. So it's the first of the great power wars where all of Europe is engaged and everybody is using their political interests to figure out what the alignment should look like. And so you see, I've got the state flags. Thank God for Wikipedia. They have these wonderful little visuals that you can steal when you need them. The war is just a bloodbath. 8 million people, it is estimated, die in the 30 years. 20% of the German population is killed. And by the way, this is this just precedes by a couple of decades. It overlaps with the English Civil War, but it also just precedes by a couple of decades a round of plague that hits London very hard and hits some of the ports of Europe pretty hard. Whole regions are destroyed. Great powers are bankrupted. And in 1648, the major parties, exhausted, form a balance of power. The modern international hierarchy of alignments and treaties is put in place. And which means that the energy that's just been wasted on the various bloodbaths and the newfound stability beginning in 1648 allows the pent up energy that was both the capitalist and industrialist flowering that was beginning to take place all over Europe, which was accompanied by the voyages of exploration. It allowed everything to just unleash an economic golden age for some places. And for instance, Holland, which achieves, the Dutch Republic achieves, as part of the deal, independence from the control of Spain, and which has interests in Belgium and had interests in Holland, but that's part of the deal. And so the Dutch Republic and its navy produce an age of wealth and an age of art and an age of literacy, philosophy, medicine. It truly was their golden age, which we'll take a peek at in a little bit. So the world at war, and here's a painting from 1614, right before the beginning of the war, and you see the Protestants and their patrons in the blue box, and the Catholics and their patrons in the red box. And so we have an allegory of the disaster that was about to come to be. And so by the time we get to 1648, and we've settled into a world that begins to look like, in fact, not begins to look like, looks like modern Europe, at least a Europe that looked more or less the same in the 17th century and in the 18th century, except for the receding of the Ottoman Empire on the lower right of the map. So Spain's dominions were still Spain proper, Sicily, southern Italy, a bit around Milan, some elements of the Spanish Netherlands up near Belgium. France is intact, England, Ireland, Scotland intact. You see that the Austrian domain, which has now pushed almost all the way to Budapest and will, in the subsequent century, take back a big chunk of the Ottoman Empire. Prussia in blue, the Swedish domination of the Lutheran elements in the north, begins to look like the world we've come to expect. Now I want to switch gear for a moment. The picture, I've used this picture and a reference to Max Weber, the great groundbreaking sociologist of the late 19th and early 20th century, who wrote perhaps the most influential book ever written by a sociologist, because it's one of the great books in the Western history of ideas, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, that had just incredible pioneering influence on historians and on political theorists and on political philosophers. And basically, his argument goes like this, in summary, that in pre-industrial society, labor was not commercialist in spirit. It wasn't just about the accrual of money. It was part of your role in the great social chain of being. Where were you born into it? Are you a peasant? Are you a shoemaker? Are you whatever? You sort of filled your role. And sustained accumulation of money in and of itself as a value was not regarded as a virtue. And thus, in a lot of old folk tales, the miser character, not just in the cartoons of Scrooge McDuck, but the misers as stingy, unnatural types were introduced to the literature. Salvation in the Catholic world was provided sacramentally. And so sacraments, in effect, provided the psychological evidence that you were saved. You got to go to confession and be verbally remitted of your sins by a priest. The bishop in your confirmation laid on the holy ointment on your forehead in the sign of the cross. You were given the body of Christ in the Eucharist. Clerical hierarchy and the sacraments they provided the sanctions of salvation and the evidence of salvation. Think of how penance and absolution work. The Reformation, of course, with its emphasis on predestination, changes the entire psychological landscape. With Calvin's double predestination, you're either damned or you're blessed. Either way, you were predestined to one or the other. There is no church corporate body. There are no priests or sacraments that have a role in your salvation or a sign of your salvation. Your own actions do have no merit. It's sola fide, sola gratia, faith alone, grace alone. The only way you could possibly know that you are saved is through the light of inner self-confidence. And where is that going to come from? The only sign to yourself or to the world was going to be your worldly success. If you were blessed with a good life, if you were Job before God decides to test him and take away his children and his flocks of sheep and all the evidence of his worldly success, to see if God will lose, if Job will lose faith in him or not. And when he passes the test, what does he give him back? He gives him back all the signs of worldly success. He gives him back money. He gives him back his flocks. He gives him back his children. The only obvious success in a bourgeois society was bourgeois success. Calvinism was, according to Max Weber, was the catalyst for a revolution of work. Work was approached differently. Pre-industrial workers often did enough to take care of the outstanding need, what they needed to in effect, feather their nest for that week or that month, and then were legendary for not showing up the next day. It wasn't in and of itself a virtue. work-saving money were transformed by this new ethic. And, and, and Weber very correctly suggests, and it is the Protestant ethic. And since it emerged at the very moment that the new forms of capitalism were emerging, it could be adopted by these new forms of capitalism and become, if you will, the rationale. It could give it a meaning system. It could give it an argument. It could give it a philosophy. In traditional pre-industrial society, sacred and secular activities were formally distinct. Okay? Poverty was unfortunate, but it was not a social stigma. If you were born poor, if you were the beggar, God made you the beggar. It was your place in the great social chain of being. It isn't that you did anything wrong. You were just unfortunate. And indeed, many of the Reformed saints of the Middle Ages, the Francis of Assisi, what did they adopt? Poverty. We'll be like the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. We'll go around with our begging bowl. There's no shame in it. God will give to us as he sees fit. It will keep us pure. We don't have to accumulate for the sake of anything. And the emergent bourgeois capitalism of Puritan reform, on the other hand, secular work had a sacred role. Accumulation was not a sign of greed, it was an obligation. And almsgiving, we can't give those poor out of work folk in COVID land $600 a week, because why would they work? Aren't they inherently lazy? Almsgiving rewards the undeserving poor. And in England, the very phrase undeserving poor was written into every poor law. Oh, this is to take care of the deserving poor, not the undeserving poor. If you lost both your legs in the war, okay, you're deserving. But, if we don't think you've got a good reason for it, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Get out there. So the model becomes work, not works. It's not the works of an independent free will that merits salvation. It's work as a sign that of God's favor, that you were saved, that you're behaving as someone who is saved would behave were they given that opportunity. Nature and the things of the world had value to the degree that they were signs and could be exploited in the pursuit of work and financial success. So one might suggest one of the downsides of this redefinition of the Protestant ethic is, and of the Reformation itself, one of the downsides might be that the entire earth and its fruits are there as exploitable. Their value is in their being able to be put to good use in the pursuit of money and financial success and growth. So let's run those oil lines through Alaska. let's chop down those forests in the Amazon whenever we get the chance, because there's a buck to be turned here. Weber quotes in a number of places Ben Franklin, something of the apostle of the new creed, if you will. Remember that money is the prolific generating nature. Money can beget money, and its offspring can beget more, and so on. So here we have this new, emerging, dynamic society, which will become a very exploitive society. Its downside, as I mentioned below, its upside will be expansions of trade, the development of markets, the invention of modern banking, breakthroughs in technology and in printing, the wonderful upside of it all. The downside is of this self-congratulatory universe that's being created in Europe is and the economic expansion, that it can result and it did result in colonial dominance, racialist theories that justified the economic domination that was being foisted on third world societies by the world that got there first. And so we're looking, if you will, at this point, we're beginning to look fairly modern. And many of the problems that bedevil the world, our world, and its attitudes are rooted in attitudes towards property and the underlying economics of an ever expanding market world that was rooted in our period. So what I'd like to do at this point is use the Dutch Republic, which is really the poster child for this rampant, self-congratulatory, successful Protestant, colonialist, bourgeois ethos that has emerged. The Dutch, a very small country, rivaling the English. By the way, in the middle of the 17th century, when the Dutch Golden Age really peaks, the English were going to be their major rivals because of trade and shipping. But it is in the 1660s that English trade gets bludgeoned for a couple of years by a combination of the bubonic plague of 1665 into 1666, followed by the year of the Great Fire in London. And so the Dutch get a free ride for a couple of years and get to dominate trade tremendously in the period. But we find their little triple mast trading vessels in ports all over the world, and they love to do paintings. There's a whole wing of 17th century Dutch painting that is just of boats, and they have quite a bit of, if you will, family pride on their ability to succeed in this line. The Dutch East India Company trades textiles and silk with India. They import spices and coffee, nutmeg and coffee with Indonesia. They start importing wines from South Africa. Yeah, or there was around Cape Town. Cape Town, by the way, is one of the few places in the world that has a Neapolitan climate. Cape Town, South Africa, San Diego, California, and Naples itself Napoli itself had these ideal climates for that sort of thing. By the early 1600s, the Dutch East India Company had issued bonds, corporate bonds, and corporate stocks. It becomes the world's first publicly traded company, soon to be followed by the English East India Company. And you realize that the setting up of stock companies meant the creation of exchanges, and we all know about the tulip mania of the mid-17th century in Holland, even though I don't have a slide of that. But they set up all these markets for trade, and the ability for smaller investors to buy shares. You could buy a share in a ship, and you could buy a sub-share in a ship. There might be 1,000 people investing in a couple of ships that were going off to India. And indeed, this gave rise to the insurance companies that could, for a price, soften the blow if one of the ships got sunk in a storm or got captured by a rival English or whoever was an enemy at the time. And all of these forms that we think of as natural forms of business institution begin to take form in Holland, particularly, and in England, particularly in the 17th century. Banking in England really was very advanced and developed several of the types of promissory notes and things of that order that we use to this day. So, continuing on with our Dutch Republic, the defenders of the Republic. This is a Frans Hals. The Frans Hals Museum in Holland has just these wonderful group portraits of probably every person in this company was painted from life. They would commission the society. This is the officers of the St. Adrian Militia Company. These are successful men. These are self-satisfied men. These are men who know their place in the world. And it was very common for them to band together in this new kind of corporate life. And here, this militia company is the military equivalent of a Reformed church, if you will. Here are the Band of Brothers. Here, and we all retain our sovereign rights. We are not under the thumb of an Oriental monarch. Here we maintain our dignity as citizens, as individuals, as members of the corporation, which we choose to join as is our individual political right. This is the theory of propertied individualism in the flesh. Whoop, going the wrong way here. On to other forms of professional society. So this is that famous Rembrandt of the 1660s, the Syndics of the Drapers Guild. So the guilds had their senior members. These are the guys, the secretary, the sergeant at arms, the vice president. Before we had Rotarians and Elks Clubs, here we have, before we had the Republican Party of the 20th Assembly District of New York City, here we have the Syndics of the Drapers Guild. And it's the same sort of thing. Here are the successful men of the new world. And we'll soon see that there will be women included too. And again, it is the Reformed church in its political expression. Another Rembrandt. You're going to throw in that one, you got to throw in this one. This is the famous anatomy lesson of Nicholas Tulp, 1632. The Dutch university centers at Leiden, among them, were famous all over Europe for studies of medicine and optics, astronomy. The leading astronomers of the day all had a Dutch foundation. And later on, the English Royal Society will pick up from that tradition. Technology and expertise hand in hand with professionalism, with the new corporatism of the emergent capitalist world that we find, and it's an urban world. It's a very urban world. You see cities everywhere, and cities being nurtured by the surrounding farmland, not as centers of disease and poverty, but as centers of success and bourgeois respectability. And here we have bourgeois respectability, two people of rectitude, both Frans Hals portraits, a man with glove in the left hand. By the way, if you can ever see these up close, whoops, I'm jumping ahead of myself. These roughs, if you ever get a chance to look at these paintings up close, the roughs that he does, if you get a chance to go to The Hague, where a lot of these things are, the Rijksmuseum. If we ever get to travel again, there's another place I want to go back to. And you know, since we have good, sober Protestant folk that we're depicting here, the color is black. We are sober. We don't go for those frivolous, cavalier, Renaissance, corrupt, aristocratic, decadent, flaming reds and yellows, trying to make themselves look like birds of paradise. We are sober folk here. We wear our black. We read our Bible. She probably has her Bible in her hand, if it's not a missal of some kind. Is that a Bible? It looks like a book. But these are serious folk to be taken seriously. They are successful. Are they saved? You bet your bippy they are saved. These are saved folk if I've ever seen them. We have men of the world, since we are all over the world. We have the Laughing Cavalier, a little less Protestant in spirit. We have the emissary of the Congo, Don Miguel de Castro, on the right, by Jasper Bex. It's a cosmopolitan world. We are people of the new age and the new world, and we will spread our wings and extend our influence and our doctrines, which we know are true. Because if they are not true, how could we possibly be this successful? We will spread it everywhere. We will have family scenes in the cult of the bourgeois family. The kiddies will make appearances, and not just the kiddies, but the family pets, domestic scenes, servants well dressed. Not a whole lot of poverty here. We are dressing for the table. Sunday dinner, every dinner, we will dress for dinner. The children will look like little adults. We will be in our private houses, solid citizens of the Republic. Whoop, again, I'm ahead of myself. And the cult of the family. By the way, it was only in the social class and in this family that you would really make a point of depicting the children, because child mortality was fairly well in hand in a world where you were introducing new standards of housing and wealth and cleanliness. So, barring a plague or whatever, children could be depicted as full members, as individuals, and full members of the family unit. In medieval portraiture, this would hardly be the case. Kids, you wouldn't count on kids because the chances that they would make it to even adolescence were long. And then simply because I had to, if you're going to show Dutch painting in the period, how could you not include a couple of Vermeers? Again, a successful bourgeois household, and I call the slide upstairs and downstairs, the well-managed household. And a man's home is his castle. We have the music lesson, an enigmatic painting upstairs, and the milkmaid downstairs. Those wonderful windows lighting the rooms that you get in all the Vermeers. Shadow across the floor. Anyhow, I've raced along pretty much, and I'm already to my very last slide, and I would just like to talk about the Reformation and its links to capitalism in kind of a summary. And that top parallel set of boxes. So you're predestined to godliness and success. And on the side of the ethic, the Protestant ethic, we have hard work and sobriety, piety, rectitude, civic duty. And on the right, the capitalist virtues sound much the same. Hard work, resourcefulness, creativity, confidence, success. The downside, as I mentioned earlier, was colonialism. The world was quickly becoming Europe's oyster. And of course, that severe imposition with its strains of racism and racialism of one kind or another that everyone must and should be converted to the true faith that you find everywhere. So missionaries are sent everywhere to bring people into God-fearing, hard-working, and industrial communities modeling those of the Northern Europeans. And the more successful you could be at that, the more virtuous the subject people was thought to be. Anyhow, that's really, I'm going to stop the share. That is really what I wanted to do with the course. I am going to Are there questions? Does it, Marty, were you going to say something?
No. And I've got ice cream trucks outside. I got to mute.
Okay. Is this the sort of the cultural heritage from Martin Luther that you expected the course to provide you with?
Yeah.
In the end.
I don't see the through line.
Oh, somebody had raised the question.
I actually have a question.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. So with all this tremendous success of, Protestants and the Reformed Church and the Dutch and everything, how did the Catholics counter that? I mean, how did they, obviously they had tremendous financial success also in terms of colonies and, obviously they were competitive, but did they adopt some of the traits, some of the things?
Well, to a degree, but I will pose the question another way. When you think of the economic powerhouses of the year 2020, you think of Germany, Scandinavia, England, the United States, or do you think of Italy, Greece, Spain, and Portugal? I'll throw in Brazil and Argentina. So it sort of answers itself. The ethos was never the same in the Catholic countries. Yeah, there are countries like France that partook enough in both traditions, and Catholic Germany, for that matter, to sort of enter the Northern European sphere. But the Southern European sphere was always dominated by holding on to old aristocracies and old oligarchies. How many ruined palazzi of minor Sicilian nobility, impoverished nobility do you find in Palermo or in Catania? And they call themselves princes. So in effect, the Catholic world had to had some running to do to try to keep up. And when you think that Northern Italy was the seat of many of the early developments, which is why, by the way, the Milanese like to refer to themselves as Europeans, not as Italians. They do not believe that Southern Italy is tethered to them. They'll tell you that in their own form of cultural racism, that Africa begins somewhere just north of Rome. But it's a good point you raise.
Calvinism is like a cancer. It really is. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, you could use that basic precept to justify anything. I could go out and I could rape a 12-year-old girl and I could state her suffering is evidence that she's damned. And since she's damned, I'm under no obligation to show her charity or empathy or pity or anything. I mean, you could basically justify anything with that. In that perspective, why was Jesus allowing the blind to see, or the lame to walk, or feeding the poor, or you know, going and speaking to the lesser elements in society, because these people were all damned to begin with? I mean, it's awful.
As Johann Eck pointed out to Martin Luther, and that one little quote I used in one of the slides, Martin, every twisted argument that anyone has ever tried to use within the dome of Christianity, they justified from Scripture, somewhere in Scripture. You know, it's amazing the uses it can be put to. So, anyhow.
The Ottoman Empire, when they saw basically Europe eating itself out raw, did they attempt in any way to try to take advantage of this, or did they have their own problems? Because I think they were basically getting to the point that they were in their sunset rather than their sunrise.
Yeah, the sunset begins about now, about the period we're in, and it becomes just a. Here, let me, It's the sunset begins in this period. It ends in the early 20th century. You had individuals within the Ottoman Empire, like the Sultan in Egypt in the 1840s, Muhammad Ali. Tried to institute Western developments and was forced by the English back into their trade group. Everybody's reading everybody's comments here. So the impact Northern Europe had on the rest of the world is just astonishing, and with its upsides and downsides. But
the Protestant cause was largely basically saved by Sweden. We have no perspective now looking at Sweden as being a great power. But for about 100 years, the guys like Gustavus Adolphus and Charles XII, I mean, they really were. If it hadn't been for the great Lion of the North, Gustavus Adolphus, getting involved in Brightonfield, Lutzen when he did, basically the Catholic League would have pretty much swept the Protestants right away.
No, that's true. Anyhow, we have a little time, but if that's it, I hope you enjoyed yourselves. We have I'm going to be doing another course in October, if anybody's interested, on the period, I think it's called the Age of Revolution, on the period between 1789 and 1848. And I might take that up a little bit further to 1860 or 70 to get the establishment of the German and Italian states into the Age of Revolution. But it's basically going to look at the impacts of the French Revolution, the rise of nationalism, and the rise of extreme industrialization in the period of the first part of the 19th century. And I'm sure Mill will send you all out notifications and enticements. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, Deb, that's very funny. These weren't your people. I think so. Okay, gang.